Doug is a research adjunct at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture and has been for a long time. In fact, were we doing our PhD at the same time? We were in the research room at the same time many, many years ago down below.
Yeah.
And he's going to speak to us about a really interesting topic today. The title of his lecture is "We Were Not of the Same Opinion, Dietrich, Bonhoeffer and Helmut James von Moltke on Participating in the Conspiracy to Assassinate Hitler." That's what you call a juicy topic. Doug, over to you.
Okay. Sorry, we may just have to leave that because I can't get that signed in, so I'm sorry, people.
Oh, okay. So you don't have the slides up?
I've got the slides up, but it's wanting to do various things to log in.
Oh, okay.
So, look, we've spent enough time.
We'll have to declare failure on the IT front.
So, apologies to everyone. Okay, first of all, acknowledging the Indigenous people on whose land we're meeting, in all their diversity and their care for this country. I also want to dedicate this presentation to a friend of mine in the United States, Jeffrey Pugh, a distinguished Bonhoeffer scholar. And he saw some things that were coming in the US about 2018. And he, in an exchange with him around this, he made some comments about the challenges facing Christians under the emerging dictatorship, if I may say. So, let me go. Here I want to explore Dietrich Bonhoeffer's involvement in the plot to kill Hitler and compare it with the stance taken by Helmut von Moltke in his resistance to the Nazi regime. Moltke is not well known in the English-speaking world, so I will end up spending some time on him and what he did to lay down the basis for the comparison with Bonhoeffer. It's commonly suggested in some of the discussion that Bonhoeffer had the option of either remaining a pacifist and thereby colluding in the evils of Nazism, or giving up his pacifism and becoming involved in the assassination plot. Bonhoeffer's involvement in the Abwehr, though, was a way of avoiding conscription into the German army. Conscientious objectors in Germany were executed. This was the fate of the Austrian Catholic peasant Franz Jägerstatter. A letter that Bonhoeffer wrote to Bishop George Bell in March 1939 is explicit. "I am thinking of leaving Germany sometime. The main reason is the compulsory military service to which men of my age, 1906, will be called up this year. It seems to me conscientiously impossible to join in a war under the present circumstances. Perhaps the worst thing of all is the military oath which I should have to swear. I would have to do violence to my Christian conviction if I would take up arms now and here." Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, a member of the resistance in the Abwehr, facilitated Bonhoeffer's was an unpaid Abwehr agent. He was not paid by the Abwehr. The Abwehr group was politically conservative, largely, and nationalist in orientation. Bonhoeffer's role was limited to exploiting his ecumenical contacts to pass on information on the activities of the plotters and to seek assurances about Allied policy towards Germany in the event of a successful putsch. His marginal involvement in the Abwehr operation to smuggle Jews to Switzerland under the guise of placing them there as German agents led to his arrest. The Gestapo suspected the operation was an exercise in money laundering, and he got swept up in that. But other than that, his connection directly with the plot was not large. His political views were in line with those of the CRES group, who anticipated after the assassination establishing an authoritarian Reichsstaat in which freedom of association and the press would be curtailed. A letter from Bonhoeffer to Paul Lehmann in the States sets out his political presumptions about post-war Germany. Nothing would be worse than to impose upon her any Anglo-Saxon form of government, much as I would like it. It simply would not work. It would be just impossible to restore complete freedom of speech, of press, of association. That sort of thing would throw Germany right into the same abyss. I think we must try and find a Germany in which justice, lawfulness, freedom of the churches is being restored. I hope there will be something like an authoritarian Reichsstaat. So Bonhoeffer's thinking about post-war Germany was strongly influenced by the conservative orientation of his family. To put it in a phrase, he was not a theologian of resistance, rather a theologian in resistance. Much of the discussion on Bonhoeffer, in my view, has read his critical theology, which is challenging and daring, back into the interpretation of his political stance. And I think that's a mistake. In getting a perspective on Bonhoeffer's stance on the assassination plot, I turned by way of comparison to Helmut von Moltke, who was about the same age as him, a descendant of the family of Field Marshal von Moltke, chief of the General Staff under Bismarck. So he comes from a very distinguished German family. His mother was the daughter of the Chief Justice of South Africa. Both his father and mother became Christian Scientists, though Helmut was brought up as a Lutheran. He was a Junker, but a most unusual one. He studied law, politics and social history at university and gained first-hand knowledge of the unemployed through work in welfare projects, developing a wide network of international connections on the progressive side of politics. After completing university studies in Breslau and Berlin, he became a lawyer. He was European in outlook and progressive, perhaps even a socialist in his politics. While managing the family estate in Silesia, he practiced international law. His wife, Freya, completed her studies, receiving a Juris Doctor of Law in 1935. Helmut visited England frequently in the late 1930s to qualify for the bar at the Inner Temple. He developed friendships with politically influential people in the UK, associated with Chatham House, and acted as a source of information on political developments in Germany during the early years of the Nazi regime. When the war began, he became a war administrative councillor in the Foreign Countries Division of the Abwehr, the military intelligence department of the German army. He was a legal advisor to the High Command of the Armed Services on international law. He retained a position in the Institute of Foreign Law and Law of Nations of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, and on top of that, he kept a private legal practice going on the side. In the Abwehr, Moltke undertook resistance to the Nazi regime in a variety of ways. Today, he reported, with sharply qualified pride in late 1939, I won my case, but it was like winning a victory over a hydra. I chopped off one of the monster's heads and 10 new ones have grown in its place. The issue of complicity in the regime was with him constantly. He was a party to intelligence about military atrocities in the occupied territories of the East. He despaired at his limited influence. In a letter to Freya in late 1941, he expressed his torment. May I know this and yet sit in my heated flat and have tea? Don't I thereby become guilty too? How can anyone know these things and walk around free? In another letter to Freya in November 1942, he reports, I was at a meeting at the Foreign Ministry about the question of the persecution of the Jews. It was my first official contact with this question. Against 24 men, and quite inflexibly, I attacked a decree which already had the approval of all ministers and the chief of OKW, and for a moment have halted its course. The decree in question was directed at making German Jews brought stateless and dealing with confiscation and appropriation of property, including that of Jews deported to German-administered areas. In a letter to Freya on the 13th of November 1941, he expresses his awareness of the limits of his efforts at resistance. And much of the documentation we have comes from a collection of letters to his wife for that war period, when he was still working for the Abwehr. He wrote frequently. The letters were not subject to censorship, so we have a very frank and detailed account. Also an account of what he was reading. At times he was reading Kant and Soloviev and so on, as well as some English novels. He says, I find it hard to remember those 2 days. Russian prisoners, evacuated Jews, Russian prisoners, hostages shot, gradual encroachments in the Reich itself of measures tried and proved in occupied territories. Again, evacuated Jews, Russian prisoners, a mental home for SS men who broke down, executing women and children. That was the world for these 2 days. Yesterday, I said goodbye to a once famous Jewish lawyer who will kill himself with his wife today because he is to be picked up tonight. He has a nice daughter of about 19 who wants to live. I gave her my address in case we or she survive the deluge. And yet I was able to throw a spanner in the works, obstructing a bit at least of the persecution of the Jews. He tried to bring the Red Cross into the treatment of prisoners of war on the Eastern Front. My chief opponent, General Reinecker, has at last found himself forced to suggest that the Red Cross should try and look after German soldiers who have been taken prisoner. It must follow that we too admit the Red Cross. Moltke also worked with the Catholic Bishop of Berlin in a private legal capacity, launching a suit against the confiscation of a church and discussing with him the latest information on the persecution of the Jews. On another occasion, he reported to his wife, I went straight to a meeting which lasted till 11 and gave me much pleasure, for I was in the murderous pit of loyal vassals of the Führer, generals and officers of the OKW, whom I routed in furious attacks. They pointed out to me that what I wanted was incompatible with the Führer order, whereupon I replied, but gentlemen, you can't hide behind a Führer order. We would grossly lack our duty to the Führer if sitting quietly at our desks we lacked the courage to tell the Führer that he was badly advised when he issued that order. And if this cowardice of yours caused the death of men at the front, that was roughly the tone and pitch of my harangue to these disgusting toadies. One by one, they all turned tail in the end. A person of considerable confidence. He sought to humanise the war, pleading for the enforcement of the norms of the law of warfare, particularly the condition of prisoners of war, hostages in foreign countries, and the treatment of civilian internees. An exhibit at the High Command General Staff Nuremberg War Crimes Trial was very telling. It was a memorandum from Helmut pleading in forceful terms for the respect of the rights of captured enemy soldiers, civilians, and irregular combatants in the Eastern Territories. However, in the margins were the pencil notes of Field Marshal Keitel saying that these rules were quaint and obsolete and reflected outmoded notions of chivalric warfare. Keitel was sentenced to death at Nuremberg. Moltke attempted to engage with both the United States and the United Kingdom using links of friendship from before the war. On 2 occasions during the war, von Moltke wrote to his friend Lionel Curtis in London. The first letter was forwarded from Sweden in the course of a trip to Scandinavia in April 1942. The letter provided an outline of developments in Germany and the response to the war by the population. In March 1943, he left a longer letter with the contact in Sweden to be forwarded to Lionel Curtis. The written version never reached London, though the key contents were memorised and passed on in summary form to government circles in Great Britain. It outlined conditions in Germany, including the systematic extermination of the Jews, extension of concentration camps, and the difficulties of organising resistance. In October 1942, Moltke received, quote, an authentic report on the SS blast furnace. So far, I had not believed it, but it was true. 6,000 people a day are processed in this furnace. He encouraged resistance to the Nazi regime in occupied territories. He travelled extensively for the Abwehr, visiting Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Holland, France, Belgium, and Turkey. He looked for allies to help thinking about the future of Europe post-war. He engaged with the German military, both the Wehrmacht and the SS, occupying authorities, to convince them of the pragmatic, if not the moral basis for minimising atrocities. He was particularly concerned to prevent the killing of hostages by the military as an automatic response to increased resistance activities. He also initiated what became known as the CRES Circle in the summer of 1940 systematically building up a network to develop the principles on which Germany should be rebuilt in the liberated Europe. He included socialists and representatives of the Catholic and Protestant churches in these consultations. The circle comprised civilians who mostly did not think that assassination was a good basis for political change in Germany. He conducted small group discussions in Berlin, often over a meal, frequently running late into the evening. At one of those early in 42, two of the Bonhoeffer, Klaus Bonhoeffer and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, were noted as having attended, but we have no further information on any further engagement in Kreisau-related activities. There were 3 major weekend meetings at Kreisau, where his property was, in May 1942, October 1942, and June 1943, covering topics including future political structures, education, issues of church and state, federalism, treatment of Nazi criminals, and how Germany would translate into a European order after the war. The circle was European, democratic and federal in orientation, as opposed to the nationalism, deep suspicion of democracy, and the commitment to an authoritarian Reichsstaat of the military plotters of the CRES Donami group. One interesting piece of writing from that work was that he envisaged a special international criminal tribunal to be convened at the conclusion of the war for the purpose of bringing justice to those who violated the rules of war. He wrote, "Any person who violates the essential principles, divine or natural law or international law, in such a fashion that makes clear that he contemptuously disregards the binding nature of such law shall be punished." We now turn to the one occasion of an extended contact between Bonhoeffer and von Moltke, and it's here that the issue of their different approach to assassination, we have reports on that. In April 1942, he and Bonhoeffer went on a joint trip organised by Dietrich to Norway. The ostensible purpose was to observe the Norwegian church struggle, viewed as a possible danger to German occupation troops. The covert intention of the trip was to encourage the Lutheran Church in their resistance to the German occupation. On the 10th of April, the trip was triggered by the arrest of Bishop Burgrave. The bishop was subsequently released from prison into a loosely policed home detention. Moltke worked with his Norwegian friends and the military associated with the conspiracy towards cooperation between the Norwegian and German resistance, while Bonhoeffer encouraged the Norwegian pastors to stand firm in their resistance. We have a report on this visit from Eberhard Bethger in his biography. He reports that for Bonhoeffer, his few days with Helmut von Moltke had made quite an impression on him. Moltke was a year younger and had founded the Kreisau group. I cannot remember in detail what Bonhoeffer told me about the conversations. We did not yet realise the group's special potential. I remember, however, that Bonhoeffer remarked to me how stimulating the journey had been, but, quote, "we are not of the same opinion." He tellingly doesn't say what they were not of the same opinion on, but that I think was quite obvious. They were united in the depth of their Christian convictions and in their judgment of Germany's desperate position. But Moltke rejected for his own part the violent removal of Hitler. And Bonhoeffer, who knew the judgment of God cannot be halted, was already pleading for assassination. Moltke said nothing in his letters home about this trip by way of an assessment of Bonhoeffer. He does refer him at one stage as the good Bonhoeffer. But they worked together in preparing a report that went back to the Adver. The difference in judgment between Bonhoeffer and Moltke on the assassination is striking. For Bonhoeffer, assassination was the only way forward. Moltke saw in such a coup the danger of a creation of a new stab in the back legend. Stephen Plant, in his discussion of Moltke's views on tyrannicide, adds that Moltke also shared Karl Barth's view that Germany needed to be completely defeated before she could be rebuilt from the foundation upwards. A military coup would in fact halt the destruction needed for rebuilding to begin. In the letter to his friend Lionel Curtis in March 43 that never got delivered, Moltke explained that if you are going to replace a government, you need to offer another one. And that means that the mere process of destroying the Third Realm can only get underway if you're at least able to offer an alternative. We have a report of a conversation between von Moltke and Bishop Burgrave in Norway on 18th of March 1943 on a subsequent visit that dealt with tyrannicide, which von Moltke opposed on several grounds. He explained that he always personally had been opposed to such a deed, not so much because he regarded it as ruled out by Christian principles, but because he doubted whether a regime inaugurated in such a way would prosper. A further, more practical difficulty was that the planning of an assassination must be confined to a small circle, whereas the planning of a new government must necessarily involve a number of people. He himself saw his chief function in the latter field, but if the killing of Hitler could not be done without him, he was ready to play his part. This is the only record of von Moltke expressing a qualified willingness to support the assassination. The conversation, it must be noted, was not written down until after the war, and so must be regarded with caution, given Moltke's otherwise consistent views against the assassination. Moltke's refusal to engage in the assassination plot reflected a political as much as an ethical or spiritual judgment. The problem, he says, has been the reliance placed on an act by the generals. This hope was forlorn from the outset, but most people could never be brought to realise this in time. We need a revolution, not a coup d'etat, and no revolution of the kind we need will give the generals the same scope and position as the Nazis have given them and give them today. In a letter to his sons written after his arrest, he comments, "But I never wanted to encourage acts of violence like those of July 20th. I thought the preparations being made for them because I disapproved of such measures for many reasons, but above all because I believed this was not the way to eliminate the fundamental spiritual evil." The arrest warrant in October 1904, let me say that he was in basically detention under an informal arrest for the 5 or 6 months prior to the assassination plot. So we don't know how he would have responded to the realities of the actual conduct of it, given that a number of people associated with the CRES who had originally been opposed to the plot did become involved at the last minute. But we just have this fairly consistent witness from numbers of different sources of his opposition. He was charged with having tried to change the constitution of the Reich by violence, thereby aiding and abetting foreign powers in wartime. He was finally convicted of something rather different, of having failed to report treasonable activities and of defeatism, and was executed on the 23rd of January 1945. We have a record of the 3 months he was in prison at Tegel prison, of the correspondence between him and his wife, both sides. The correspondence was carried in and out by the chaplain, who was a member of the CRES circle, who took tremendous risks. But we have 150 letters jointly and a very close, deeply powerful reflection between the husband and the wife of both the efforts to deal as carefully as he could with the legal side of things, but also his spiritual journey during that time. It's very, very powerful. Moltke was delighted to be executed for something worthwhile that he had done. We didn't want to use any force, that's established. We didn't take any organisational step or speak to a single man about the question of whether he should want to accept the position. What it came down to was this: a private individual, namely your husband, is known to have discussed things that are the exclusive purview of the Führer with two clergymen of both denominations, with a Jesuit provincial and with several bishops, without the intention of doing anything concrete. Issues concerning the practical and ethical demands of Christianity were explored. Moltke seems to have been an agnostic when he married, but during the struggle against the regime, turned more and more to Christianity. In his 43 letter to Lionel Curtis, he references this shift in his belief, arising from his commitment to resist the Nazi regime. In discussion before the war, I maintained that belief in God was not essential for coming to the results that you arrive at. Today, I know I was wrong, completely wrong. You know that I fought the Nazis from the first day, but the amount of risk and readiness for sacrifice which is asked from us now, and which may be asked from us tomorrow, require more than right ethical principles, especially as I know that the success of our fight will probably mean the total collapse as a national unit. So where does this leave us? I think it goes back to the issue of the reception of Bonhoeffer from the radicalness of his theology has obscured the importance of his family in shaping his values and driving his involvement in the assassination plot. We should assess him as a decent human being, Vicky Barnett says, trying to find his way during a terrible time. And he reflects in his after 10 years on the impossibility of being a decent human being in terrible times. Victoria Barnett emphasises the political rather than the theological character of his writings on resistance. Bonhoeffer's pacifist turn was serious, and he never withdrew from it theologically. And that's where some of the theologians who have been writing on that are right. They're absolutely right. But what they try and do is minimise his connection to the plot. And I think that's wrong, though they are right to say he was not heavily involved. He didn't carry a revolver around. He was not involved in any of the practical arrangements. His role was, if you like, spiritual in providing encouragement and support for those who were doing it. And he did not attempt to justify theologically his stance on the plot. He thought it had to succeed and is willing to answer his own participation. So he was responding as a citizen, not as a theologian, with the need to present a theologically coherent system to justify his decision. Stephen Plant suggests that his theology of vicarious representative action is theologically rich and thought-provoking, but that Bonhoeffer's political judgment was flawed. So to become involved, whatever you did in that stage, you were going to become complicit in it. Anyone involved with the advent, regardless of what they actually did, was, as von Moltke points out, implicated in the conduct of the war and shared responsibility for the war crimes. And Bonhoeffer acknowledges that in his comments after 10 years. So we shouldn't read Bonhoeffer as offering as a source of empty assurances of larger-than-life heroism. We need to see him as he was, a theologian, a pastor, with strong theological commitments that were in tension with what he thought was needed as a decent human being and citizen. And that's a tension that's never collapsed, and I don't think should be collapsed. Moltke rejected the necessity of the assassination plot as a matter of political judgment about the best path to the future of Germany. He used all his legal skills to put spokes in the wheels of the regime and then lived out what Bonhoeffer described as the arcane spiritual discipline. He lived that out in his last years in prison. In view of the situation in the United States, and with a nod to my friend Jeff Pugh, I offer the following learnings from Bonhoeffer and Moltke in very short summary. In an authoritarian regime, everyone becomes complicit. Moral courage is necessary. Political clarity about the consequence of what is happening is critical, and communities of moral discernment to envisage a better future need to be created.
Doug?
Sorry if I rushed that.
That was absolutely fascinating. We have about 21 minutes to make comments or ask questions of Doug. If those online wish to ask a question, can I ask you to use the hand up icon function just so it's easy for me to notice, and I'll try and keep an eye through the back of my head. On the screen, who would like to kick off the discussion? Mr. Bonhoeffer, yeah.
Oh, no, just only to make a comment of context. I mean, Bonhoeffer was arrested in April 1943. So, I mean, I think there are a couple of things. There were a number of plots against Hitler. July 21 is 44 is the best known, by which time Bonhoeffer had been in prison for about 14 months or so. It's not clear from his prison letters just how much he knew about that plot, but it is clear that before July 20 he had hopes of release, and after July 20 his hopes of release faded very quickly. But this idea of just how complicit he was is very hard to get a handle on, I think, given that he was in jail. He was also a little bit unlucky. I mean, both were with the Abwehr, but Bonhoeffer had the family connection with the plots, so it was a little bit hard for him to get away from the conversations that revolved around it. So he was possibly a bit closer to it than he would have necessarily wanted to be, but then had to deal with those consequences. Anyway, that's just...
To that I would say that reading from the other really good book on this, Bonhoeffer, is Sabine Dran's book. And she also emphasises the fact that he was involved because of the family. He felt responsibility to the family, and he felt in tune with the family. And so I'm wanting to say, detailed knowledge of the plot, not so much. Encouraging and supporting those people to go ahead and do what he and they thought needed to be done, very much. And I think after 10 years is a reflection on that, is with the plot very much in view. But I suppose I was starting this, as I said, because there's been a tendency in some of the right-wing nationalist Christian in the States to take up Bonhoeffer's involvement with the plot as the justification for violence, and to place him very close to the action of the plot. In that, as I understand, in that movie that we were talking about before.
That's sort of what happens to Bonhoeffer. The Conservatives take him in one direction, and the Anabaptists take him in the other.
Well, I think that's right, and I think that the Anabaptists theologically are right in their judgment about. He never gave up that, but he never collapsed that back into a systematic justification for what he did. That was there, and if you pressed him on those issues, he would still stand with them, but he still lived with that absolute tension and contradiction. And it's that tension that I think needs to be emphasised and is at the back of behind this discussion.
Can't you be a pacifist let us imagine you were at Bondi shopping center and somebody is shooting around. Don't you have to stop that person with whatever means? Without stopping to be a pacifist?
Yes, but I don't see that as being analogous to Bonhoeffer's situation.
Why not?
Because I mean, you throw yourself into the situation to try and save it, but you probably won't have a gun if you're in Australia.
Yeah, but he gave a lecture just before that in Denmark, saying that you should be a pacifist.
Yes.
And then your suggestion is that he stopped being a pacifist.
No, he completely wasn't. This is the tension, the paradox, is that he stood by that. And the theologians who have affirmed that are right, but they have also tried to distance himself from the plot. And I think they're wrong on that. I think because his family connections drove, and his political judgment that this was the way forward. And my argument here is to saying, well, here's someone else who was opposed to it, von Moltke, who made a completely different political judgment.
Yeah, can I ask about that? Because I was very surprised to hear that, I think I heard you right, to say that Bonhoeffer and the ones that he was alongside were nationalists who thought that getting rid of the Führer was a good thing, but replacing it with another dictator, who presumably is a more benevolent one. Was that
an authoritarian, not a dictatorship, but shift. Bonhoeffer didn't believe that you could shift to a democratic Germany.
Do you know why?
I'm not sure that I think that came from his background. That was the assumption of the people he moved with, of his family, and the people who were pushing to remove Hitler.
So what you're drawing out is that he had a conservative political philosophy.
Yeah.
And so then when he came to be supporting the assassination plot, his preference was a conservative state.
That was his political judgment.
Reputation.
Yeah.
He did have quite a deep suspicion of the masses.
Yes.
He wasn't comfortable with that idea, so that sort of eliminated socialism, and I think it probably also impacted on his view of the democratic process as well. So.
Remember, in this era, there's a lot of skepticism of democracy, including on the left. That's why you get
Weimar Republic hadn't been a particularly related either, so
a lot of people don't trust the masses in this era right across Europe on both sides of the political fence. So that's not. It sounds more shocking today to our ears than it was in that time.
it was probably more unusual to be a progressive, I suspect.
Yeah, that's why von Moltke is described as the most unusual Junker. He has, both though had strong international connections, though of different sorts. George Kennan, the American foreign policy person, was in Berlin shortly before America went to war and met and talked with von Moltke. And he says in his memoirs that he was the most impressive person he had met on either side during the war.
Oh,
A person of moral clarity and judgment. I have to drop that quote out. But it's interesting that someone of his standing came away with that memory of von Moltke. So yeah, I think it's quite clear, and I mean, John Moses' book on Bonhoeffer brings this political conservatism out. He documents that, I think, quite well. It was a shock to me when I first started to read it and realised I'd skimmed over these letters of Bonhoeffer and not fully registered that. But yeah, it's and I suppose it's part of the process of coming to a more rounded and complex view of who he was. That he was able to make these advances theologically in quite challenging directions, while at the same time remaining a political conservative. Sorry, someone.
We're going to Helen online next, who's been waiting, and we'll come back. And then we'll go to Nick after. Did you want to speak as well?
No.
All right, sorry. Go ahead, Helen.
Thank you. And thank you, Doug. Is there any evidence? I didn't understand whether Freya's letters are available. The evidence of the influence that she may have had, or indeed did have, on his spiritual thinking.
Yeah, the letters for his last 3 months in prison, her letters are there, side by side. It's not clear that she had a particularly strong influence one way or the other. They were a fairly similar sorts of family backgrounds. But they shared very, very deeply. So, yeah, she comes from a sort of Rhineland background, on the Rhineland, from family were business people on the Rhineland. It's the interesting thing is the sort of the Christian Scientist background, which is because his father became a healer and translated the works of Christian Scientist works into German, which is quite interesting. So you might look at that as being exposed to that minority influence of being conscious of being a minority, but it's not clear that it had any direct influence on him, because he does refer in his letters during the war to going to sermons by Hans Lilly, and actually on the day the war was declared, he was reading papal encyclicals, social encyclicals. So he had an ecumenical approach. Spiritually, he had little contact with the confessing church as such, and does refer, though, to how much he enjoyed the community aspect of the church gatherings on his property in Silesia. But that's never up front till the last 3 months.
Thanks, Doug. It seems very clear anyway that he put great store in writing all of this to Freya.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Nick? Oh, sorry.
I think we'll go to Nick straight on.
No.
Okay.
It doesn't matter.
Go ahead, Nick.
Thanks, Doug. Really enjoyed that. I wanted to pick up on one of the comments you made towards the end with the sort of implications of this. So you talked about complicity. Could you unpack that a little bit more for us? How we should make sense of that? Is it a blanket complicity, or is it gradations of complicity? How do we understand our own complicity in these systems?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question and a difficult one. My takeoff point was some of the discussion which tends to draw a line between becoming complicit because you did nothing, or avoiding complicity by actually becoming involved in the plot. And I don't think that's right. Anyone involved in the government at that stage was going to be complicit. I mean, the other comparison to sort of draw the line about the difficulty in a complex society of avoiding complicity is Franz Jägerstätter, the Austrian peasant, who refused to take payments from the government, from the Nazis, and sought to basically avoid any engagement with the government that he could avoid. And that makes it clear how difficult it is in the sort of society we have. So I suppose what I wanted to say is that we should not get hung up on that, but say, given that we are complicit, what is the way forward? What can we do with the gifts we have in the terms of the social power or lack thereof, to find our way? I mean, I don't know how much more I can say than that, but to sort of try and reject the idea that we can avoid complicity by undertaking self-righteous acts or becoming on the right side of things. We're all going to be complicit to some degree. The question is, what are the possibilities for action of ourselves, but also what can we do in conjunction with others to try and put spokes in the wheel? And that's going to be different for everyone. Sorry, I don't think that answers your question.
No, and I don't expect there to be an easy answer to a question like that. I take it as a real fundamental challenge for us to keep sitting with. Perhaps the other side of the coin, or if it's useful to think of it as having another side of the coin, is to think in terms of the extent to which we're beneficiaries to these systems. And that helps to highlight our complicity.
Yes.
I think that in a way Bonhoeffer addresses that question himself. I mean, when he talks about historical events taking place in an endless twilight, basically, and he says that it's not necessary just to distinguish between good and bad, but between good and bad and less bad. So, I mean,
Yes.
that's the tension that you speak of is something that he clearly recognises.
Yeah. I think that's right in his ethics. But particularly because it's not teased out philosophically in after 10 years, that attempt to reflect on the situation of what becoming involved in this has done, and even doing what we can to put a spade in the wheel, the compromises, the lack of trust that builds up. How will we survive out of this? And recognising that it has damaged much of who we are. I think that's he's absolutely right on that.
Just going to go. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
Sorry, because we did skip you once before. So
Look,
we'll come to you in a moment, David.
I think the distinction which you make between a theologian and a citizen, I think it doesn't work. I mean, we are all theologians and citizens at the same time. And given your good intention, whatever you do is the right thing to do. I think it just avoids the problem to make that distinction.
Well, I don't know that I can say, except to say that it helps me think about what the tension was in Bonhoeffer, because there was quite obviously things that couldn't be pulled together. And I'm trying to understand that. It's a tool for understanding, not an absolute choice, I think.
David?
Thank you, Doug, and greetings to all of those who in Canberra whom I know. I didn't know anything about von Moltke, so thank you, Doug, just for the introduction. Did he ever clearly express if assassination had ramifications that wouldn't be helpful in his view? Did he ever express a view about how long I mean, did he just hope that the international forces against Hitler would eventually take Germany out of the war, or did he ever express a view about how long, the world could cope with having a Third Reich, causing mayhem? What was his, in a sense, what was his alternative to the position that Bonhoeffer seems to have supported?
I mean, I think what his view was that Germany would not win the war. His view, pretty much from the start, was that it would not win the war. The other thing to think about is that he doesn't do a lot of thinking about hypotheticals. He's a lawyer. He deals with specific cases. He deals with, what can I do now with this SS general that might save some lives? What can I do here that might help generate some thinking that will yield a better world after the war? So I tend to think of him as, his instincts are those of a lawyer, to deal with the specific case in front of him rather than try and anticipate abstract possibilities out in the future. But it's quite clear at times he said that for a while there I was a bit worried, he was worried that the war was not going to end well, but probably by about 1942, mid-1942, he was confident that it was only a matter of time. He had no faith in the generals, and he thought they had some self-interests of their own that would not be healthy if they, for the future of Germany as a democratic country, if they in fact were to come out on top in a coup. He thought, again, a political sociological judgment. So he's a case-by-case person. Can I just quickly read something to you from his last letter to his wife, as we're getting close to the end. Here we go. God implanted in me that socialistic trait which freed me, though owner of a great estate, from any suspicion of representing vested interests. Then he abased me as I have never been abased before, so that I have had to give over all pride, so that after 38 years I finally understand my sinfulness, so that I am learning to pray for his forgiveness, to entrust myself to his mercy. Then he permitted me to experience to an unheard of depth the anguish of parting and the fear of death and the terror of hell, so that this too is over and done with. And then he endowed me with faith, hope and love, this in a plenitude truly lavish. Sorry, there he's not a lawyer. There he's speaking of deeply personal Christian experience in a prison cell, his letters on that profoundly moving. So I think the answer is no, he didn't sort of attempt to make those judgments, but he anticipated that what was happening is awful. How can we live knowing that this is happening? But you still have to live and do what you can in specific circumstances to alleviate the pain, to perhaps give some people a chance of life. So I think he's a complex character, I think you would have to say. But obviously,
I guess you, just a brief remark, I guess it does make a difference. If you don't think a tyrant is going to last or last long, then the question of whether you take him out by force is, perhaps less pressing, isn't it?
And I think his work in the Kreisau Circle was an affirmation that he thought at some stage in the not distant future, thinking such as this was going to be needed. And so it had to start now. So there was a degree of hopefulness, I think, in setting up a think tank for the future of Germany and Europe in the middle of destructive war is a tremendous sign of hope, with all the risks that involved.
We do have to conclude, but I just want to make one brief comment related to that, because the thing I find most fascinating that came out of your paper is that both men are making different political judgments about the effects of this assassination. But of course, the assassination was unsuccessful. So we're left to make moral judgments of their moral judgments without knowing what the outcome was. So we'll never know who was right, or maybe both of them would have been wrong. And that adds a degree of interest and complexity to me in terms of how we do this kind of historical work.
The only thing I'd say in that is that some of the themes that emerged from the CRES House Circle could be seen to have been picked up in post-war Europe, particularly in the Christian Democratic Party thinking. So we can only just look at that and say they were thinking in a direction that, as I would say, had more hope and was creative for a future. And that, I think, is worth thinking about. But they made both profoundly Christian, deep Christians, having to make political judgments under tremendous pressure. And I don't want to be, I guess all I'm trying to do here is open up the balance and recognise the complexity of Bonhoeffer's choices, and also the importance of family for him. I think needs to be acknowledged too, because the thing there is that Bethger, when he moves closer to the family, he gets then invited into these discussions that open up the plot to him.
Could I just say in relation to that it's not just the family though, because initially he vested a lot of confidence in the church, particularly the confessing church. Yeah. And he was disappointed. And increasingly, as we get into the 1940s, he began to think that really the best of people were not in the church, they were outside it. And that in some ways, some of the most godly people in Germany were in the resistance. And so he was then thinking about how he can best make them feel, as you said earlier, better about their choices. So I think that also, it was bigger than the family. Yeah. It was also a disillusionment with the church.
Yeah. But it raises, doesn't it, a real question about a kind of issue of purity. I mean, how much can you engage in acts of violence and still remain a pacifist? How much can you do something that is wrong for the right reasons? And how much do the right reasons justify the wrongness of the action? And these are things that I suspect we will only know on the resurrection.
It's a fitting note, I think, to thank Doug for an excellent paper. Thank you to all those who joined us online. Great to have your company and participation. Excellent paper, Doug. Thank you.